Hello, Mr. Ruth here. This lesson on imaginary numbers is about powers of I. I think this is one of the more interesting aspects of imaginary numbers, and I hope you agree. So let's talk about what I to the 0 power is, I to the first, I to the second, and I to the third. Now, we know what I to the first is, right? We've defined I as the square root of -1. So when I ask, well, what's I to the first? It's just I, all right? It's the square root of -1. But let's look at what the other three are. I to the 0 power. Now we know from our study of exponents that anything to the 0 power is equal to 1. So I to the 0 power equals 1. What about I squared? Well, I squared equals I times I. And of course, I is the square root of -1. So I squared is the square root of -1 times the square root of -1. Now, we know from our study of square roots that if we are multiplying two radicals and they have the same radicand, that the answer to this is whatever is underneath the radical. In other words, if I have the square root of 5 times the square root of 5, I combine the things under the radical, that's the square root of 25, that equals 5. If I have the square root of 2 times the square root of 2, that's the square root of 4, that equals 2. If I have the square root of anything times the square root of anything, that equals the thing under the radical. So down here, if I have the square root of -1 times the square root of -1, that equals -1. Finally, I to the third power. Well, I to the third power simply equals I to the second power times I to the first power. But I know I to the second power equals -1. And I to the first power equals I. So I to the third power equals -I. So there's a little chant that I came up with where you just say 1, I, -1, -I, 1, I, -1, -I, and so on. And we'll see how this comes in later on. So let's look at this. We know that this is 1, I, -1, -I. But what are all these? What's I to the 4th, I to the 9th, I to the 15th? Well, the thing to recognize here is what I to the 4th equals. I to the 4th is equal to I squared times I squared. But I squared equals -1. So this equals -1 times -1. Well, that's just 1, right? -1 times -1 is the negatives. Negative times a negative is a positive. So I get 1. So I to the 5th, well, that's I to the 4th times I to the 1st, based on the laws of exponents. Well, I to the 4th is just 1. And I to the 1st is just I. So I to the 5th equals I. What about I to the 6th? Well, that's just I to the 4th times I squared. Well, I to the 4th is 1 from up above. I squared is -1 from here. So this equals -1. It's the same as I squared. I to the 7th. I to the 4th times I to the 3rd. I to the 4th is 1. I to the 3rd is -I. Multiply these together, I get -I. What are we noticing? Well, I to the 0 is the same as I to the 4th. I to the 1st is the same as I to the 5th. I to the 2nd is the same as I to the 6th. I to the 3rd is the same as I to the 7th. And this pattern is going to continue. I to the 8th equals I to the 4th times I to the 4th. But that's just 1 times 1. So this equals 1. If we multiply this out, this would be I. This would be -1. This would be -I. Face is in the way there. Over here in the last row, this would be 1, this would be I, this would be -1, this would be -I. So this is where this pattern's coming in, right? We have 1, I, -1, -I, 1, I, -1, -I, and so on, okay? Now, if I ask you what I to the 14th is, or I to the 11th is, you could have this whole chart, but there's actually a pretty easy mathematical way to figure this out if you have the first 4 memorized. So what you do is you take 4 and you divide it into the exponent. So 4 into 11, how many times does that divide in? Only twice, but then you say, what's the remainder? Don't turn it into a fraction or decimal. figure out what the remainder is. Here it's a remainder 3. So I to the 11th is the same as I to the third power, and I know that that equals negative I because I have the first 4 memorized. In other words, I to the 0, I to the first, I to the second, I to the third. Let's do it again. 4 into 34. How many times? 8. What's the remainder? 2 left over. So I to the 34th is the same thing as I squared. That equals negative 1. I to the 249th. Yikes. 4. I'm always dividing 4 into whatever the exponent is. I to the 249th, well, it goes in 6 here and goes in 2. And what's my remainder? 1. So I to the 249th is the same as I to the first, and that, of course, is just I. So this is how we would simplify powers of I. Again, the trick here is to have this first row memorized. If you've got that memorized or you can write it down quickly, you can do all these problems pretty simply. Thanks for watching.